Welcome to this seminar. My name is Mikkel Funder and I am a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies. The seminar is called Beyond Green Grabbing, Rights, Governance and Nature-Based Solutions in the Global South. Welcome to those of you in the room and those who are watching online. And welcome to our presenters especially. Some are here in the room. Matthew, as you just saw, is online in Tanzania. We hope that he will remain online. And for those of you who are watching via the live stream, if you want to ask questions, there is a link below the live stream where you can type in some questions. And then we will have a look at that once in a while if there are any, and if there are too many, we will select a few. So I'm supposed to give you a little bit of an introduction to this exciting but also very broad and large theme. And there are many places to start that story, and there are many voices who could tell this story. But today I will start it here with the global biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. Just to keep it in mind for everybody, the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on ecosystem biodiversity and ecosystems, estimate that an average of 25% of animal and plant species are threatened. From 1970 to now, we lost about 68% of the actual population sizes of most mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles and fish, according to the Living Planet Index. There are major declines in the condition and the extent of the most important ecosystems. 420 million hectares were deforested from 1990 to 2020. It's been a bit better recently, but now again not so good. An almost 50% decline we have seen in one of the most important but not so much talked about ecosystems, namely wetlands, since 1900, a 50% decline. This chart here is an attempt, it's also from the IPBES report, but it's an attempt to try and show what IPLCs, which is a new fashionable word for indigenous peoples and local communities, what their opinions are on the trends of nature across different ecosystems. I don't know how much you can see, I won't go into detail. Some might claim that this is Western science that is trying to capture indigenous knowledge, but it is based on studies and research of what indigenous peoples how they assess ecosystems. And I think that the general point coming out here is that there is also, according to these studies, a concern there. This is tropical forests, savannas, drylands, and so on. Now today we're going to be talking about place-based conservation a lot. Conservation that takes place in particular areas. But I think it's important to keep in mind that apart from the direct drivers of biodiversity loss and ecosystems degradations, there are also underlying systemic drivers. Our global production and consumption patterns, the food systems, the unequal allocation of resources. So I would venture to say already now that what we're talking about here today is not perhaps enough in itself. There's a need for global systemic change in some of these issues as well. On the table right now, by many actors in different alliances, are different global attempts to scale up nature protection in order to address biodiversity loss in ecosystems, climate change by, for example, storing carbon in forests and in wetlands and so on. And they go by various names and have various people involved. The Half Earth Project, the Nature Needs Half Initiative, the Global Deal for Nature. They're called Half Earth projects because there is a sort of a general tendency to say, let's protect 50% of the Earth's surface that will be necessary in order to protect biodiversity and keep our ecosystems going. And much of this potential is in the global south. This map here shows the number of threatened species. You can see the intensity here across the south. This is an attempt to map where the biggest potential for ecosystem restoration is. The issue, of course, and one of the issues, is that there are an awful lot of people, ordinary populations of the world, living in these areas. There are different studies coming up with different numbers of that. It's like I would say about 1 billion people or more I live in the areas that are currently under the Half Earth Initiative. 760 million of those live in areas that would have to be expanded, so that are not actually currently protected areas. The Rights and Resources Initiative estimates 1.5 to 2 billion people. And here's a study that was specifically on the potential for forest restoration. 300 million people who live in areas that have potential for forest restoration. 1 billion live within 8 kilometers of that area, and of course would be also dependent on downstream effects and so on. A study has been made about how the indigenous peoples' lands are positioned in relation to these conservation initiatives. Indigenous peoples manage or have tenure rights over more than 25% of the world's land surface. And they have 37% of what is estimated as the natural remaining ecosystem, areas that don't have heavy societal or population development or infrastructural development, depending on how you assess that. And 21% of the indigenous people's lands, according to this study, are already within protected areas. And then, in addition, there are all the communities, local communities, who are not categorized or do not categorize themselves as indigenous peoples. It's probably important when we talk about the land issues to also keep in mind that there are differences. The big whitish part here in the African countries is areas that are owned by government. The green is areas that are designated for indigenous peoples and local communities, and the dark green are areas that are owned by indigenous peoples and local communities. So there are differences, and therefore the land issues involved in this do also differ from of course from setting to setting. So the big question is, these global conservation schemes, what are the risks and what might happen, what might go wrong? And there is a concern expressed from various sides of green grabbing and appropriation of nature in the name of conservation. There's a concern that the inclusion of communities and indigenous peoples will be instrumental, that it will not really benefit them, but just be in order to get some conservation done. Concerns over loss of rights, resources, culture, marginalization of the poorest, a reduced resilience then, because people will lose the livelihoods that they're supposed to cope or deal with climate change for, and perhaps intensified conflicts over conservation, which will then also be bad for conservation. Or is it an opportunity to position indigenous peoples and local communities at the heart of conservation and secure their rights rather than undermine it, and to address poverty and resilience, to benefit from the knowledge and the hundreds of years of experience with conservation in communities? And is it an opportunity to move beyond this duality or dichotomy of nature on the one side and society on the other that we have maybe especially in the West developed as our understanding of the world? Those are some of the things that we would like to discuss today. Before we do that, just briefly looking back a little bit, this is in some ways, some of these discussions have been going on for a long time. Some might say it's old wine on new bottles. You could say if it's good wine, then it's okay to be in new bottles. If we look at the development of community-based conservation, that's been going on for a long time. Back in the 1970s, conservation was almost strictly authoritarian and top-down. Then there was a beginning of sort of handing out benefits to communities. In the 1980s, then in the 1990s, documents started talking about communities as stakeholders. They had a stake amongst others. And then there was gradually a turn in the literature and in the documents towards seeing communities as partners and as stewards. So rather than a threat or somebody who had to receive a little bit of benefits as an incentive, there was a growing emphasis on communities as partners. At least in principle, right? So there's lots of studies showing that this certainly has not always gone well. Now you could say that there are different approaches to community-based conservation, which are also embedded in the different approaches to conservation. I won't go into them in detail here, but there are sort of a divergence right now in different approaches: half-earth new conservation science, conservation from within, convivial conservation, biocultural conservation, decolonizing conservation. They all overlap, but there are different thoughts about these things now. Maria and I did a study on community-based conservation, looking at the literature from the most recent years, and I just wanted to just look at quickly at some of the sort of key lessons learned, if I may still use that word, which came out from there. You could say that community-based conservation has expanded, but it's not consolidated. It's been unequally applied in different settings. In some countries, we see that community-based conservation, the state rolls it back, so they might have given out rights, they might have given out benefits, but then they start taking it back. A good reminder that things and political landscapes change, and that an achievement can sometimes be rolled back. There is also militarization of conservation in some areas, by which is meant that you actually, you use guns, fences, and so on, as we have seen for a while, to protect wildlife and so on. Community-based conservation must be better anchored in local livelihoods and economies. It's a huge dependency in many community-based schemes and in conservation in general in the global south, on, especially in Africa perhaps, on funding coming from the north, either via tourism, hunting, or simply from projects and philanthropy. Big dependency, which COVID-19 showed. So that has to be diversified, those funds. Economic compensation and income substitution is not enough. So in a lot of places, the actual funds generated from community-based conservation is not really enough for people compared to, for example, what they might gain from harvesting the forest themselves or using the land for agriculture. The emphasis on working landscapes might have potential. So these are ideas about how we could have wilderness closer to cities, and cities in the wilderness, so to speak, so where we break down this idea of having a distinction between nature and society, where conservation follows naturally from the way that people manage resources, as they have been doing for a long time. One of the things we also found is that those places where there has been national associations built for communities to align together to put pressure on governments, those are actually the places where, even though governments try to withhold funds or rights, that there was suddenly a platform built where communities and civil society organizations could push and advocate. But let's move. I think that's quite interesting, actually. There's also a need to maybe to link community-based conservation more across different communities, across different forms of land use, and also upwards in the system, so that communities are not just, as I said, represented locally, but also nationally. And then, of course, very critically, we have to devolve the rights. We have to give out access rights. That's what the literature actually says. It actually says that you also get better social benefits from that. Whether you also get better conservation benefits, some will question, but there are, as we will also hear, a number of studies saying that yes, you do actually get that. You can read more about that, just to make the commercial spot, in some of the working papers and the policy brief that we have online, which should also be on the live streaming page. So that was just sort of to set the context, the background. And I think now we will go directly to Marie and to her presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marie, and I'm also here at DIIS. I'm a researcher here. maybe I should just start saying my throat is a little off, so I hope you can hear me. My voice is okay, but I'll try. So, as Mikkel just mentioned, in the end here, you now have a multitude of new approaches to nature conservation, and that in different ways integrate development aspects to conservation. And one of those new approaches is what is called nature-based solutions. So in this talk, I'll go into detail with nature-based solutions and look at how they integrate rights to use, to access natural resources that at the same time are sought protected. So some of the next speakers will also go into nature-based solutions from different angles. So I'll explain what nature-based solutions, or NBS, are on paper and in practice, and then illustrate some of the challenges that can occur with the ecosystem that is targeted as part of a working landscape, as Mikkel also pointed to. So let's start with definition. So according to the IUCN, nature-based solutions is to be understood as an umbrella term for approaches that protect, sustainably manage and restore natural and modified ecosystems, that address societal challenges and effectively and adaptively, and that simultaneously provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So there are three legs to that concept, and they hang together, and it is essential that they hang together. This also means that if NBS is done right, then protection of species and ecosystems become very key, or completely key actually, to secure water, to secure food, income, well-being for people. And therefore biodiversity conservation is a key component of nature-based solutions. So there should then also be sort of a core element that directly targets societal challenges like climate change adaptation, like mitigation. And this is what provides an insurance for people and ecosystems on the long term. And also, if you have wise management of the natural resources that include a human development perspective, then NBS has the potential to sustain, to restore ecosystems. So the legs hang together and they reinforce each other. That's the general idea. So then, to disaggregate these three legs a little bit, IUCN has put together what they call the global standards, sort of to guide implementers, to guide project managers. And the global standards consist of 8 criteria, I listed them here, and then 28 indicators, so a few indicators for each of the criteria. So these 8 criteria, they can be used in the design phase by project managers to ensure that a potential project adheres to the overall standards. So it's a guide that instructs users in how to assess, self-assess the design of a new NBS project. It also guides on how to identify if there are any gaps, and how to evaluate projects when they are done or finalized. And all these criteria and indicators are directly or indirectly relevant for a rights-based or pro-poor approach. So, for instance, if you look at criteria 6, I just put in, I couldn't fit all of them, so I put in just the 3 indicators that are for criteria 6. So if you look at 6.2 here, it says the rights, usage of, and access to land and resources, along with the responsibilities of different stakeholders, are acknowledged and respected. So that has to be ticked off for an NBS activity or for projects in order for it to adhere to the standards. So in practice, the NBS approaches cover 5 overall types of interventions. It is this umbrella term, you could say. So you have some approaches that are restorative in nature. You have some that are issue-specific. So this could be ecosystem-based adaptation that I'll come back to in a minute to illustrate a little bit what this means in practice. You also have some that circle around infrastructural challenges, some that have to do with management and protection. But all these 5 types, they all still are framed around these 3 legs and are guided by the global standards. So then, to explain a little bit in practice, the practice side of NBS, I'll look then under the umbrella, and then we can look at this issue-specific approach of ecosystem-based adaptation. And here the three overall legs are then specified. So you have human well-being, you have management, conservation and restoration of a full ecosystem. And then you have the third leg as climate change adaptation as the societal challenge. So EBA has been, or ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA, it's been applied to a range of different ecosystems, but in particular there's been some good results, or it looks like there's been some good results with when it's used in coastal ecosystems, and in mangroves, for instance. And if you look at mangroves, then what happens there is that you, by restoring the full ecosystem, then you can shield communities against storms, sea level rise, and then at the same time support livelihoods and local economies with fisheries, for instance. So in that sense, it's there has been some good indications that seems to work. So it's also necessary to distinguish then when we look at challenges, because there are challenges to this as well. So make a distinction between what we would call pure EBA approaches and EBA relevant interventions. So the pure EBA is where you really have this balance between the three legs. All are directly integrated. And then EBA relevant is where you maybe have a primary focus on one or two of the legs. And then the third or two of them are sort of, well, they are assumed that there will be a trickle-down effect. And one of the reasons that interventions may end up in this way is that it's challenging to include all those stakeholders, institutions, sector ministries that are relevant to a full ecosystem. So if you, for instance, if you talk about a river as the targeted ecosystem, well, then you have to include the fishermen's downstream, you have to include the irrigation farmers upstream, the facilities or industries that might be on either side of the river. You can't just look at one side of a river, then it's not the full ecosystem. So, and then for integration of governance and legal measures that are also very an essential part of this, well, then you need to involve departments for fisheries, departments for agriculture, infrastructure, health, and the list goes on. And this, of course, then, to make it even more complicated, has to take place on different scales, from local to national scales. So therefore, in the implementation, then project managers could be inclined to cut corners and then make do with EBA-relevant approaches. But if this becomes a trend, then that is a problem, because one could then be concerned that it could create sort of a slope back towards this more single-purpose adaptation or conservation approaches. Mikkel mentioned this already in his slide. We've been there already. I don't think we want to go back. So there might be some of you who are now thinking, well, wouldn't these EBA-relevant approaches find it difficult to live up to the global standards? And they would be unable to call themselves NBS interventions. And sure, there are certainly some indicators that would require some inventiveness. But when we can actually also see in the literature that there are EBA practices that are found today that carry the NBS label, even though they have few, if any, direct excuse me. They have few direct benefits for livelihoods. So, for instance, some projects might work to transform smallholder farming to use organic fertilizers, and then they assume that such a transformation would also have positive impact on food security. But if the design is built on such an assumption, then the direct relevance to smallholders, well, that becomes a big question mark, actually, because it's built on an assumption. So I wanted to just point to a few overall challenges that we found based on the literature we looked at. So there are suggestions that many EBA projects do not contain the required level of participation. And to exemplify this, you can get much opposition from involved communities when land is set aside for EBA activities, especially if this happens without full consent or support. This is nothing new. We've seen this before. It could also be that there are compensation systems that are missing or not sufficiently in place, also not new. So some of the literature that we looked at also said that there was a problem with misconceptions, misunderstandings of the way EBA is communicated. So a communicative problem, how it's communicated to stakeholders. And some of the other speakers will talk to this, so I won't go into this. So looking at what aspects are necessary for successful interventions. And the first point here follows directly on what I mentioned on the previous slide, that successful projects provide equal attention to the ecological and social dimension. There has to be a balance between the legs. Then next, ensuring community rights to ecosystem resources. So this is critical to a pro-poor result, to a rights-based approach. So if project designs don't clarify issues of tenure, issues of access rights, then it can mean that communities effectively lose access. They lose access to critical resources. It could be water, it could be pastures, forests, and that they are essentially unable to harvest the benefits of the project that's been implemented. So when an intervention involves the regulation of a community's existing user rights, then this should always be the result of a negotiated agreement with the communities. And it should be implemented by communities themselves. And then similarly, also clear and lasting social economical benefits for the communities, well, that should be part of it too. What was interesting when Mikkel and I looked at the literature here is that it looked like, it seems that there were more examples of successful interventions in ecosystems with shared user and ownership structures. And so this could be commons or coastal mangrove areas. And this could be that the clarity on resource tenure and access largely determines the scale of what can be implemented. So this may be the reason why many projects in dry lands have focused on protecting existing biodiversity, forests, national parks, rather than starting to restore private lands that might have been degraded by intensive farming, so working landscapes. And if there are multiple ownership structures in place, well, within this targeted ecosystem, well, then implementation becomes more complicated, and especially when you compare it to common use, so like coastal zones or mangroves. So that could be the reason. EBA, as well as other NBS approaches, involves many different stakeholders with many different interests, and therefore it's also inevitable that conflicts arise. And so it is also recommended by much of the literature that conflict resolution forums are put in place so that grievances can be addressed and conflicts can be resolved. And this is emphasized in the global standards in Indicator 5.1. But when you look at the literature, that it is problematized that few of these mechanisms are actually implemented so far. So this might be one of the corners that are cut. So overall, we can say that NBS are not automatically supportive of local rights to natural resources, simply because IUCN's indicators and criteria prescribe it. It doesn't come by itself, and how things look in practice may differ quite a lot. So until now, I've talked about the importance of not compromising the global standards and committing to an emphasis on the rights aspect. But it's also worth mentioning that NBS can impact non-NBS interventions. So interventions that may not even be, they might be very far from the ideals of NBS to begin with. But although programs like this may never actually become NBS, the fact that improvements are made to assimilate is an impact that is worth mentioning. So I'll talk a little bit about that. An example I'll give is the Great Green Wall. So here you can really talk about a working landscape. So the Great Green Wall is a massive greening initiative for those who don't already know it. And it's set out to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land across the Sahel. The aim is to plant 100 million hectares of range of dry lands with trees and vegetation, and to sequester 250 million tons of carbon and to create 10 million local green jobs. So, except for the massive scale here, this all maybe sounds a little bit like NBS. And indeed, it does engage a number of key issues that are related to nature-based solutions. And it even uses NBS language in promotion materials, you can see. But there are a number of factors that make it impossible for the Great Green Wall to, as a whole, adhere to the IUCN's global standards. It's not NBS. So overall, the size has created problems. So there have been many issues with safeguarding rights of local communities in all those different contexts that 100 million hectares of rangelands comprise. And firstly, it's caused the potential value of degraded land to actually increase. And in some areas, this has led external farmers to then grab land and displace farmers and community members. And this has especially then affected those that are already marginalized, so women, youth, pastoralists. And in some of the reviews of program documents that we looked at and the literature that has reviewed program documents, well, then it looked like privatization of land was approached as a benefit in itself. So there were scholars that reported that you have an extensive misconception of tenure relations in these program documents, where sort of there's a reference to landowners that is made consistently. So you assume that the land is owned or privately owned. And if they do that, then that means that privatization is sort of assumed despite knowing that there's a century-long history of pastoral use in large parts of these areas. So therefore, much of the literature also criticizes this limited understanding of local stakeholders. They report a weak inclusion of decision-making among local communities. There are a number of other challenges to the Great Green Wall, but I'll just focus on those. And what is interesting now, and I'll round off now. So despite all this criticism, the Great Green Wall has in recent years actually taken the criticism to heart and attempted to make certain adjustments. So now the Great Green Wall has turned from this stringent wall of trees into a more fragmentation of sub-projects that are sort of autonomously run by partners, by donors. And in that way, the Great Green Wall has, well, it's become this umbrella idea for smaller projects that where each project at least has the potential to better adapt to local conditions, and where NBS standards in some places can be followed appropriately. So there are examples where the interventions become more holistic and include the building of roads, of marketplaces, and this shows the move towards NBS somehow. Because if restoration of forest ecosystems is to benefit communities, well then there needs to be markets, there needs to be roads to facilitate that they can come to earn an income from agroforestry products. So there are examples of success from some sub-projects in some areas. And it looks like some solutions have managed to strike the balance of benefiting livelihoods and avoiding to cut off user groups. So despite the critique of this watered down NBS activities with what I referred to before as NBS relevant projects, well, then we can see that there is this popularity of the NBS term or the NBS approach, and that in itself has come to sort of raise the bar for rights-based and inclusive standards even for non-NBS activities such as the Great Green Wall. Now, this is not to say that there aren't a lot of problems with the Great Green Wall in general, and there are, but at least this we found this would be worth noting. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marie. So what we will do now is that we will just take a few questions for Marie while we get Matthew's presentation up and running. So does anybody here have a question for Marie? Yeah.
Thank you. All right. thank you for the presentation. I think I personally enjoyed from when you started up to the end, I really enjoyed your presentation. But there are two things that I just want to maybe find out from you. Unless I've missed out somewhere, I just want to find out whether the nature-based, the MBS projects, did they consider the traditional authorities in implementing their in trying to implement their projects? Because for what I know, in most African countries, the government owns just a small portion of the land. In Ghana, for instance, government owns only 20% of lands. About 80% is owned by by non-governmental organizations. So obviously, if you don't take these people on board, it becomes difficult if you are trying to implement a successful if you are trying to implement a successful greening project. And there are some particular places where the people themselves already have a community-based way of conserving their environment. So my question is, do the projects consider these community-based norms, or maybe it didn't? Those were not taken on board. Then I think the last part, you mentioned a target of about 10,000 hectares of range and dry land has been targeted to green. So I want to find out from you, do you try to still involve the community members in this particular project or not? Because hitherto now, people used to plant trees at no cost. But now, even with the huge investment that are ongoing, we are not able to succeed. So are you considering the reason for this? Or maybe, as you try to, or as we go ahead with this particular target? Thank you so much. I'm grateful.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. If we talk about the first one, so traditional authorities, whether they are included, and they're supposed to be included. But I think that we've also seen examples where this doesn't always happen, and where you might, if you do include on a local level, maybe you include local government, but that you don't take in more than that. So that's definitely a challenge I think we've seen in some of the literature. Then now the other question, this is with the Great Green Wall and this massive area where you are planting trees. And you're absolutely right. Of course, there are people have been planting trees and part of their livelihoods. And in the Sahel as well, this has been a part in some areas. But it's also it's important to also not generalize here. And that has been the problem for the Great Green Wall projects, that they've had a generalized approach. And you can't with 100 million hectares of land. And there's also a big difference between the heart of the Sahel and all the way out in Ethiopia. If you compare that, you have to have different approaches. So therefore you have now made this fragmentation where you can have smaller projects that are led by donors, and that then really try to then consider in some cases this more holistic approach where you take in, okay, what is actually going on, what means something to people in this particular context. One of the things that Mikkel and I also found in our studies was that sometimes there can be such a big difference between even neighboring communities, right? So, and I think this is also nothing new. I think a lot of studies have shown this. So it really problematizes a generalized approach to many things. Yeah.
I suggest we take one more question. All right.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Can you say a little bit about the material behind it? I'm wondering. I mean, this term nature-based solutions is something that has turned up only in the last couple of years, and it must have been difficult to distinguish which write-ups to include and which ones not to include, and also the academic literature, the peer-reviewed literature, usually is 2-3 years behind. So can you say a little bit about the studies you have involved, and whether you were, I mean, there must be quite similar initiatives that have been undertaken in the past that were not labeled nature-based solutions. Did you include them or not? It would be interesting to know a little bit about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we probably haven't looked at every single bit of literature or of article that is out there, but we've tried to at least look at some that go far back, so that we see when these initiatives are started, and then also follow up. But you're right. I mean, of course, there's a delay in academic literature coming out, so what is going on exactly right now might not have been considered. But we've tried, and we've also looked at something that's not academic literature to somehow get the newest input.
All right. Yeah, no, I think, and I mean, for the part of the study that Marie is talking about now, we looked at what was labeled nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Marie. Let's clap again, yeah. So our next speaker is Matthew Mabele from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Dodoma. And we have actually cheated a little bit, so we have recorded Matthew's presentation. So he is with us online and hopefully will be able to answer questions afterwards, but what you will see now is a recording. I'm just saying that in the interest of, you know, not getting into fake news territory here. But it was made especially for this seminar. All right.
My name is Mark Mabele. I work as a lecturer at the University of Dodoma, Department of Geography and Environmental Studies here in Tanzania, and I'm quite excited to be part of this seminar, which and I'll be talking. Welcome to this talk. My name is Mark Mabele. I work as a lecturer at the University of Dodoma, Department of Geography and Environmental Studies here in Tanzania, and I'm quite excited to be part of this seminar, which and I'll be talking about a topic which is quite I'm very passionate about it. And it is something that I'm currently involved as a researcher, but also I'm also trying to be involved as sort of an activist in terms of trying to change how conservation practice in science is. So today's talk is going to base on what do we mean by decolonizing conservation, because this is something that is quite of recent importance and is very much debated in conservation literature. So I'm going to be talking about what does it mean by saying decolonizing conservation. So it's going to reflect on some of the things that I've been doing since my PhD, but also some of the ongoing projects, writing projects that I have concerning this topic. But before I go further in terms of explaining and dwelling into what it means by decolonizing conservation, I would like to first start by sort of having a very brief reflection on what is the meaning of decolonization, you know, as a concept, but also as a movement and as a process of trying to delink from the historical legacies of colonization. So the concept decolonization and the movement decolonization began in the 1950s, to be exact, 1955, where there was a conference in Bandung in Indonesia. And this conference was organized by countries that were colonized. And one of their very important agendas was trying to talk about the oppressive effects of colonization in different facets of life of people and states in the formerly colonized countries. You know, but later on, it was sort of taken up by Frantz Fanon, who brought it into the academic discussions, and then recently it has been taken up by some of the Latin America thinkers, such as Walter Mignolo, but also there's Anibal Cuyano, who sort of have further expounded on this concept in the process. But in essence, decolonization means, it has a variety of meanings according to these different thinkers. But I would just like to focus on one of the meanings which I think is also important for today's talk, which is concerns about the life, indigenous land and life. and how these legacies of colonialism have quite affected, the indigenous life and land in different dimensions. And one of such dimensions in terms of the knowledge forms and production systems, because these are emanating from the Western ethics and values. And so decolonization, in that sense, it is about confronting and delinking from such legacies, which has affected the indigenous land and life, and how indigenous communities and people are related to their natural sources and land. But also it's about engaging in epistemic disobedience from the universality of Western knowledge, which has been the most dominant knowledge system, but also the most dominant knowledge production form, which is dominating across different facets. And so why does it matter to have this sort of talk and thinking? It matters because, as I've briefly pointed out, it matters because the historical legacies of colonialism and its condition of coloniality has had quite tremendous impacts on the culture and lives of people and communities in the formerly colonized countries. And this is very much discussed by the Peruvian thinker Anibal Cuyano, who brings this concept of the coloniality matrix of power, where as Walter Mignolo, the other Latin American thinker, in his book The Darker Side of Renaissance, but also in the book The Darker Side of Western Modernity, he also talks of the close relationship between modernity and the coloniality of modernity and coloniality. So, for instance, what Mignolo argues that there's no modernity without coloniality. So the two thinkers try to link, these sort of two systems, and they showcase how such systems have brought this devastation in the cultural and the living condition of the people in the former colonized countries. Because such two systems, and the intersection of the two systems, have led to this expropriation of the culture and the cultural discoveries of these colonized people, but also it has led to the humanization of these colonized people and also repression of these people's forms of knowledge and knowledge production systems. So in essence, it means that it has brought this modernity and coloniality, modernity going with the colonization process, but also even the capitalism, economic structures. It has brought quite devastation upon the living and the living systems of the people in the former colonized countries. For that case, but also it has also been very much evident, in areas such as conservation. So that's why in today's talk I'm also going to be talking about how such processes, are unfolding in conservation, and what do we mean when we talk of decolonizing conservation. So I've been reflecting on some of the works that I've done, but also some of my ongoing projects that I'm doing on decolonizing conservation, and also sharing on what so far I and some of my colleagues, we have come to understand when you talk of decolonizing conservation, what do we mean? So I have several reflections, and the first one is when you talk of decolonizing conservation, we actually mean about embracing and appreciating the local socio-ecological histories, because this has significant implication on conservation practices and conservation policies. Because once the positive contribution of people through their land use practices is ignored, and how that has contributed to some of the ecological dynamics, if this is ignored, and then it might lead to some of the policies which might restrict and put life restrictions on these people, and then affecting their living and livelihood systems. This has been quite evident in several studies that have shown how local people's land use practices have actually positively contributed to the ecological dynamics. There's a recent paper in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Science, which shows that people have actually shaped, most of the terrestrial nature for over thousands of years. But also there's also studies in the Miombo woodlands of Southern Africa, which also shows the same conclusion, where local people's land use practices such as shifting cultivation and charcoal making, livestock grazing, have actually shaped positively the functioning and the dynamics of the Nyombo. So this is one of the first sort of meaning that we have so far been able to reflect and gather. But also the second meaning is also, when you talk of decolonizing conservation, also mean about diversifying knowledge, but also knowledge production systems. So this entails being, it entails the element of water mineral element of epistemic disobedience. So being disobedient to the coloniality of knowledge, the coloniality of knowledge, which has quite shaped how knowledge is produced, but also they have quite shaped knowledge forms in the formerly colonized world. So, and also I reflect this in one of the recent papers that I've collaborated with colleagues, Judith Cross and William Kiwango, where we talk of such possibility of diversifying the knowledge production systems, where we talk of one of such possible options that we have in Africa in the form of Ubuntu as an African ethic, but also as an African philosophical view that might change the way that we think and the way that we engage with nature, the human environmental interaction in the South. But also it's about also moving away from problematic, in most of the cases, unsuccessful protected area philosophy. So this is a philosophy that was sort of brought up when there was with the ignoring of the positive contribution of people upon the natural environment in the global South. And because, as I've said in the first slide, in the previous slide, about how people's contribution, positive contribution, are ignored. So one of the end outcome of such process is actually the establishment of the protected area philosophy. This protected area network that we have in the South have been as a result of such thinking. And these have actually been very problematic because they have caused all the negative social consequences, but also they have been very much unsuccessful because they are very much contrary to the indigenous and ethics such as the Ubuntu that I've just mentioned, but also indigenous ethics in other parts of the colonized and formerly colonized countries such as Southern America, but also even in Asia. So that is what we mean by decolonizing conservation. But also moving further in terms of what we mean by decolonizing conservation, it's also about diversifying voices in the representation in conservation knowledge platform. And here I'm going to share one of our ongoing writing project. We are trying to, so we did sort of a bibliometric analysis of the conservation research and literature in Tanzania over the last 50 years. So this is one of our ongoing projects. And actually what we have been able to see in the analysis and exercise so far is the dominance of the Western researchers when it comes to conservation knowledge in countries such as Tanzania. And these two graphs shows how, exemplifies what I've just said. On the above graph, it shows the H index of researchers who have written and published on conservation in Tanzania. And as you can see, this represents top 20, researchers who have the highest H index. And as you can see, there are only two Tanzanians. It's Munishi, but also it's Degradation. But the rest of the researchers are not Tanzanians, are based from countries in the Western world. But also the other graph in the left corner, it shows productivity of researchers who have written and published on conservation in Tanzania. And again, as you can see, it's again the Western researchers have also dominated in such productivity. It's only Munishi again and Degradation as Tanzanian researchers who feature in the top 20 of such lists. So this also sort of connects with a very recent article by Trisos and others who argues on the same sort of conclusion, in terms of trying to even to change, these authorships and citation practices in conservation knowledge platforms. So when you talk of decolonizing conservation, this is one of the areas that is we tend to mean, but also it's one of the areas that requires quite attention if you want to really decolonize conservation. Further, when you talk of decolonizing conservation, we also talk about we also talk about the need to diversify ecological sciences and conservation sciences, especially in terms of the linking such sciences and the results and analysis from the dominance of technocratic analysis, but also the dominance of the natural sciences, which has been quite dominant in the conservation science and practice. This has tended to exclude other disciplines such as the social sciences and humanities. So when you talk of decolonizing conservation, this is also what we mean in terms of trying to delink from such a dominance to integrate and include social sciences and humanities. There have been also in the literature, some of the scholars have also talked about sort of constructing a new science, which is integrated conservation science, which tends to also include the human dimensions, but also which tends to also prioritize issues of social justice in research designs and also analysis and the findings. So, and the last point to explain what we mean by decolonized conservation, which I think is very important, sort of sum up what I've just highlighted, is the need to transform conservation training in the pedagogy. Because what we are trying to argue is that we can't really transform and have this decolonial conservation if you're not to change how we train, conservation scientists, and how we sort of teaching methods that we use in that. And for that case, what we are trying to argue is that we are trying to call for sort of an axial evolution, trying to bring different ways of thinking about conservation, trying to run away from thinking about conservation, which has been dominated by Western values and Western ethics and Western perspectives. So this is in sum what we mean by decolonizing conservation. So to finish up, in conclusion, I mean, from all the explanation that I've just pointed out, I mean, in essence, it tries to show the importance of being accountable to indigenous sovereignty, but also the indigenous futurity, because that matters a lot. And that is actually, for that, decolonizing conservation is the key. And by that we mean that we need to sort of shift in terms of, we need a very much radical shift in terms of the perspectives and worldview, especially by also recognizing the underlying exclusionary knowledge practices that have tended to dominate conservation science and practice. And by that, if we can be able to achieve that in a sort of a way to reframe conservation for nature and people, prosperity in non-Western ethics and values. So if we're able to do that, in essence, we will be able to realize decolonizing conservation. That will also sort of bring the need to embrace prosperity of both nature and people, which has been actually sort of different from the current conservation approaches, which has tended to sort of offer more prosperity to nature and ignoring people. So by that we mean there's actually no conservation without people, and decolonizing conservation tries to emphasize on that. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew, for that. I noticed that there were actually 3 Danes on your list of the most published researchers on conservation in Tanzania, one of whom will be speaking in just a little while. So it's a complicated world. Matthew, I see you're now with us online here. That's great. Good to see you. Are there any questions for Matthew here? Yeah? We just need a microphone. Yeah, the microphone's gone.
Thank you very much. That was really a very interesting and important presentation. I wanted just to ask you on the last sentence where you have non-Western ethics and values. I just want to push you a little bit on that. We have in our Myanmar climate research group just read and engaged in discussions about climate justice. And there what's forwarded is perhaps in this global struggle is perhaps less of a non-Western ethics and values, but more of a non-capitalist or a non-market-oriented approach to some of these questions. So I just wanted to ask you, is that really, could we substitute a non-Western with that so we don't reinforce these kinds of boundaries and dichotomies? Or what's your view on that?
Hello? Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. As I have said in the recorded presentation, I think according to Walter Mignolo, it tries to show how these logics of markets, but also on capitalism, are very much connected to Western ethics and values. You know, so when we talk of Western ethics and values, we tend to talk of values that are not rooted in such Western systems, you know, capitalism and markets, you know. And I think taking the question, but also the discussion further, linking to today's discussion, nature-based solutions, and some of the things that we are also writing, we have an invitation to write a review on nature-based solution, the colonial conservation. So one of the things that we're trying to show is that such new and catchy schemes, you know, such as nature-based solutions, and the old schemes, you know, such as REDD+ and REDD, they all have two things in common. One of them, they all rely on market logics in capitalism. Another thing that they rely on Western epistemologies and ontologies. You know, so when you talk of decolonizing conservation, we are trying to move away from that, because when, for instance, some of these indigenous ethics, such as Ubuntu, actually they are relied on ethics of sufficiency, you know, which is quite contrary to capitalism. Ethics of sufficiency, but also ethics of relationality and communalism, you know. So, and this is very, very much the same way also when you think of movements such as Bonneville in South America, but also even the Eco-Swaraj in India, you know. So, so ours, we don't intend to sort of reinforce capitalism and market logics, because, you know, these are logics that are pretty much predicated on Western ethics and values. You know? So that's what we are trying to showcase and argue. Thank you.
All right, I have a question from the web. So just to give the watchers a chance also. Matthew, can you hear me? Yeah. So,
yeah.
So there is a question here. How transformative do you actually think that nature-based solutions is? Is there potential to actually change the situation through these nature-based solutions approaches?
Yeah, so thank you. So as I've said, we're actually writing something on that. And one of the things that we have, so far been able to gather is that despite being sort of a new and catchy term, but actually still the underlying assumptions and philosophies are still very much rooted in these problematic perspectives. You know, as I pointed out in the previous question, they are sort of rooted in logics for markets, but also on the same Western ethics and perspectives, that tend to be in some of the cases, or most of the cases, they tend to be contradicting to the socio-ecological realities. So if nature-based solutions is sort of rooted in these philosophies, and then its success might be very questionable, but also I've also heard Marie's talk, but also knowing from some of this nature-based solution literature, such as by Nathalie Sedon at Oxford, when she writes on these 4 guiding principles for nature-based solutions, she mentions one of the principles that in a nature-based solution initiative has to have, it is to be built on indigenous consent, and this also is very problematic because I think you might know, this concept of the free, prior, informed consent is also problematic because it may be used as a tool to legitimize external-driven interventions, but also because as it has been shown in the literature, the free, prior, informed consent actually has also been sort of co-opted, but also consent tend to be manufactured with powerful and elite people within local communities. So because of such dynamics, then the possibilities are very much difficult, I would say, and I think that is what we are also trying to showcase. Unless if it really integrates these ethics that are relevant to the socio-ecological realities on where these interventions are going to be taking place. If that is the case, and then maybe there might be some potential for such solutions to really change, bring both ecological integrity, but also social justice.
All right. Thank you very much, Matthew. I think in the interest of time, we should probably move on to the coffee break, or tea break and cake break. But let's just give Matthew a hand, and thanks for attending, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now on to the next session and next part of the program, and the first speaker now we have Jens from Copenhagen University, Department for Food and Resource Economics, if I'm not mistaken. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Cool. Excellent. So I have approximately twice as many slides as minutes, so it's going to move fast, so get ready. But before I start, I just wanted to come back to this question of whether we can just think about capitalism as opposed to decolonizing. And I thought about it in the break, and actually Anibal Quijano, who's one of the kind of people that was invoked by Matthew, his point was that we cannot understand the way that capitalism has unfolded over time without thinking about race. Capitalism has been thoroughly racialized, so that's why we need to decolonize and not only think about capitalism. So anyway, thank you so much, first of all, for having me come. And yeah, I work at the Department of Food and Resource Economics, and I've been working on participatory forestry, RED+, and now these natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions for around 20 years. I've done a lot of work in Tanzania, so as you know by now, and so I'm one of these unfortunate people who need to step back now and let others publish, which I'm very much for, and I'm so happy to see people like Matthew stepping up and really doing some amazing work. Right now I'm looking very much into corporate plans for natural climate solutions, so more the kind of climate mitigation side of natural nature-based solutions. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, and I think maybe my talk can be kind of summed up in saying that while we talk, corporations are acting, and they're acting fast. So we need to pay attention to what they're doing, because otherwise all our wishes and ambitions for these nature-based solutions could already be defeated by what corporations have already set in motion. So the corporate world is really moving on this. This is from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where around 2,000 corporations are now collaborating with this initiative to set so-called ambitious climate pledges and goals to reduce their emissions in line with science, supposedly. Outside of that, there are a number of other initiatives. But this initiative alone, which is maybe the most famous and the one that's seen as most legitimate, gathers already 2,000 corporations. So it says a little bit about the scale of this. And one of these corporations is Microsoft. This is a real trailblazer company in the sense that they want to be carbon negative by 2030, so that's in 8 years, everyone. And they want to remove all their legacy emissions. So all the emissions that the company has ever emitted since it was established in 1975 or something, they want to have taken that back out of the atmosphere by 2050. So these are some of the ideas of these companies. So how are they going to do that? If we look a little bit deeper, what we can see is that they do not here we go. They do not expect, to reduce their emissions, that's the light blue here, completely to zero in 2030. They do expect to reduce their emissions quite a lot, right? But they also expect to develop something called carbon removal. So they expect to develop some processes that somehow take CO2 out of the atmosphere and puts it somewhere else. So what are they thinking? Are they thinking a carbon sucking machine like this one, which is placed in Iceland? It's called a direct carbon capture and sequestration initiative. The problem with this is that there's only a handful of these presently existing around the world. So it is a real thing. It does do this trick. It sucks carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it in the ground. And they're also extremely expensive to run and highly energy intensive. So no, that's not what Microsoft is thinking. This is more like what Microsoft is thinking. They're thinking about forestry. They actually say on their latest update on how they're doing with their program that nearly all the carbon removal solutions we are purchasing are short-term and nature-based. By short-term, they mean that the storage of that carbon is in trees, and trees can burn, and they're part of what we call the active carbon cycle. So they're not geologically sequestered like fossil fuels. They're in the active carbon cycle, and the CO2 could be emitted again to the atmosphere. Microsoft would like to do more sequestration on geological timescales, but it's just not available right now. And that's what all companies in the world are facing. They really want to invest in ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere and reduce their emissions net, but there's just not that many options out there apart from the land-based, apart from the forest-based. So this is what we're looking at, or maybe more something like this. This is a big plantation, and the good thing about plantations is, of course, that you get lots of more carbon per hectare, and you also get the possibility of profit from that investment by selling wood. And if we see the big financial institutions that are moving into this right now, they are talking a lot about how to make it investable, that you can earn a profit from the products that you're producing. So not only for climate, but also as an investment with commodities. And also, plantations are good because you actually only remove carbon when you plant new trees, right? If you just conserve a forest that is threatened with being harvested or removed by someone else or turned into another kind of land use, then you're not actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. You're just avoiding that it is being emitted. So according to several scientific publications, there's a huge potential for this in terms of climate benefit. And if we look at the cost-effective potential, which is very much what interests big institutions such as the IPCC, for instance, but also companies, of course. Then much of the potential that we're looking at, I'm so bad at this little thing, sorry about that, is centered around countries with of course many land-dependent and poor and vulnerable communities. So that's where some of these potential risks are coming up. And it's not only Microsoft. Big Oil is also very much interested in this. We have Shell, Eni, the Italian company. Eni has pledged to plant 40 million hectares of land with trees in its climate plan. We have Equinor, the Norwegian, that has of course been very active in REDD+, which was kind of the predecessor maybe to what we call natural climate solutions now. And one problem with this, or one risk with this, is of course the question of scale. So this is Shell. Shell wants to reduce its emissions or offset some of its emissions towards 2030. And some people at at ActionAid then took upon themselves to try and calculate, so how much land would you need for all those trees if we have some assumptions about how fast trees grow, etc., etc. And Shell's plans imply that we would need an area the size of Netherlands times 3 by 2030, planted with trees. As far as I know, they haven't started yet, right? But these are the kind of implications we're looking at. This is one company, one oil major, right? And there's many oil majors out there. There's airline companies. There's all sorts of other companies that also want a bite of this cake. And what else are oil companies doing? Well, it's not like they are planning to immediately stop producing oil and gas and coal. These are capital expenditures for oil majors over the last couple of years. And what you can see down there, if you can see it, is renewables. The rest is investments in a continued production of fossil fuels, right? And they're also still busy financing lobbying and other activities to counter effective climate regulation, right? Big food, same kind of picture. So I'm basing this on the reading of sustainability plans of companies that we've been doing in the last couple of months. Big food, here I'm talking Nestlé, Tyson, Cisco, Archer Daniels, Midland, some of these major food corporations around the world. They're kind of doubling down also. They all have sustainability plans. They all have climate pledges. Many of them are certified by this science-based initiative. They rely heavily on technological and nature-based innovations to meet their targets in the plans, right? Nothing is implemented. It's in the plans. It's in the papers yet. But they still want to sell the protein, which is food that consumers want, and they want to produce net zero milk. And all of this relies on these assumptions about incredible innovations and efficiency gains within their existing forms of production, as opposed to going more vegan or vegetarian, offering different types of products. They all say that they will do that. Some of them are even showcasing individual products that they are starting to push on new markets, but the vast majority of their climate plans relies on these kind of things. And then, of course, with food companies, they're land intensive, right? So many of these dynamics of tree planting, of agroforestry, of soil regeneration, so that the soil ties more CO2 into, has more carbon into the soil. Those are part of these plants. So they're insetting as opposed to oil companies that are offsetting outside of their own value chain. But the land requirements are the same, right? We're talking huge areas of land where production needs to change rapidly. And many of the smallholders that these companies buy from in the end are supposed to completely change and transform the way they produce. So we see a lot of push again down to people who are vulnerable and are already struggling. We also see that offsetting is back big time. Not only do these companies want to be carbon neutral in some distant future, already now they offer their customers, such as Shell here, carbon neutral diesel, so that we can continue to drive our fossil fueled cars without feeling guilty. And this not only Shell, but also Delta. Delta now promises or tells us that we don't have to choose between seeing the world and saving it. I was really loving that quote. Anyway, so what am I... oh yeah, so what we're seeing also on the voluntary carbon market, that's where all these companies go out to buy credits, is that we're seeing a drastically increasing demand. Most of the supply here, because when demand grows, right, we need supply to grow us. Also, most of this growth in supply of credits comes from forest and land use. So it's not renewable energy that's being rolled out or some other kind of measure that could generate these credits. It's very much happening in the land sector at the moment. Too fast here. Sorry, I'll just take a second. But I had to do all those slides in such a short time. Okay. So where am I going with this? Much of what we're seeing could just be tactics, right? They're distracting us, right? It's not going to happen. They're not going to invest in all these trees. All this land, will not be captured. No green grabbing is impending. But if that's the case, then we have a climate issue, right? Because they're still pushing products. They're still planning to produce a lot of beef, a lot of meat, a lot of oil, coal. So if this is not going to happen, then we're cooked. If it is going to happen, then a lot of people who are living and depending on these areas are maybe at risk, right? Because corporations and the companies that those corporations buy credits from are, of course, also pushed to do this cost effectively. So there will be a drive to do this at low price as long as it is driven by the market, right? As long as it's driven by corporations that in the end have shareholders as their main clients. So then maybe we're looking at this kind of green grabbing risk that we've already been talking a little bit about, if it happens. And that's what I'm thinking about here, because as we've already heard, lots of studies have gone into the biofuel peak some years back, and RED Plus. We have mountains of studies indicating that poor and vulnerable people will be at risk when these processes unfold, at least when they unfold in the way that these rushes for land unfolded, which was very much this kind of market-based model that we've been talking about. So we need to do something different if we want to avoid that risk. Militarization we already talked about, so I don't want to go much more into that. Only that we often talk about this in relation to conservation, but within forestry, which is my own field, we also see this push to militarize. We see forestry administrations in Africa giving their officials, their bureaucrats, not their bureaucrats, but their field officers, military equipment and training increasingly. So it's really is a kind of concerning move. And of course, another thing that's going to be at risk is biodiversity, because much of this looks poised to transform something like this into something like this, exactly because it is, in the short term at least, much more efficient at producing a lot of carbon and a lot of credits in a short time. What this will also entail, if it happens, is of course that we will see a continued development, like what we have been seeing over the last decades, of a small elite that continues to live way over the planetary boundaries, their share anyway, whereas the rest of the world will, continue to have to restrict their livelihoods and their development opportunities for the elite to continue to enjoy meat and luxury consumption, etc., etc. And one final point that I wanted to make is that we're not in the 1990s anymore. In the 1990s was when carbon markets really started to kind of pick up for the first time, and early 1990s. And since then, we've burned through around 45% of the oil and gas and coal that we have burned since industrialization, right? So it's much later now. The carbon budget is almost spent. So this notion that we can continue with the kind of production activities that these companies are foreseeing while pushing the burden of reductions mainly over to the land sector, it might have worked 30 years ago as an idea, but it's definitely probably not going to work this time around, because the challenge has just grown, plus some of the ecosystems that we want to become more resilient and more effective at sucking carbon out of the atmosphere are themselves increasingly challenged by climate change. And if some of you are following this debate, studies are pouring out almost every day confirming this in various parts of the world and in relation to various ecosystems. So what's new here? Much grander scale ambitions than what we've seen before. Companies are, when the carbon markets initially came in the 1990s, and again when they picked up in the mid-2000s, there was some finance, but what we're seeing now is at a much greater scale. So the green grab that could be impending will be faster and bigger than what we've seen before. So there's more financial momentum. We have less time because we have less carbon budget. Ecosystem destabilization is already happening. We see a bit more in different technological devices. We can measure things a little better than we could earlier. We can monitor things real time that we couldn't earlier in terms of forest development, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a change there. There's also blockchain and all sorts of other ways in which companies that are developing tech are thinking that they can make this function or work better than it was before. And then we see this worrying trend of militarization. But we also see positive, I guess, more discursive emphasis on indigenous people and more emphasis on regeneration and restoration as opposed to tree plantations, which were much more in focus earlier on. But there's also a lot of things that's not new, right? It's a lot of the same dynamics that we've been rehearsing for the last 30 years in our attempts at doing something about this crisis. So what could we do instead? And now I'm ending for those of you who are concerned about time. So we could reorient our societies, wealthy societies, towards more equality and the delivery of well-being on a reduced material footprint. There's tons of research showing out there that in terms of delivering prosperity for 9 billion people on this planet is possible. Everyone can live a decent life we just need to reorient our societies towards it. And one could ask, should we start by letting companies reorient the global south into plantations, or should we start somewhere else? And in terms of conservation policy more narrowly, insist that this step is taken before we do anything else, would be my advice. And then decouple conservation from offset markets, because I think that as long as we have a market imperative where companies that are, beholden to shareholders or want to generate a profit, they will push to cut costs. And that's where we see some of these corners being cut and people get hurt in the process. We have seen that, at least empirically, in the last many, many years. And then reorient conservation and forestry away from paternalism. I could have said decolonize here, but Matthew had that heading, so I wouldn't want to say it here. And militarization. And paternalism, I mean some of the stuff that Matthew ended by talking about, how forestry and conservation professionals are trained in particular ways that orient them towards being very suspicious of local people and of their practices, as opposed to supporting and nurturing of those practices. And education-wise, we could do that. There's a lot to be gained there, I think, if we want to move ahead with a more, what Matthew called, convivial form of conservation and nature preservation outside of our own borders. That was it. So what did I start by saying? Yeah, so while we talk, corporations are acting, and they're acting fast, and they're going in a particular direction. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to that, because otherwise all the things that we talk about here could be, defied by what's happening outside of this room.
Thank you, Jens. Thanks for that we don't have to choose between seeing and saving the world. I haven't seen that one before. That's an interesting one.
It's the newest.
I think we have time for just a few questions before we go on. Anyone here? Yes, Mike?
A very quick question. Examples of where people are following your alternative pathway. Do you have some examples? I mean, the indigenous movements in Latin America, for example, have been battling away at some of these agendas for a long time. But I'd be very curious to hear if you could give us one or two examples of where positive progress is being made in the sense that you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I actually have I'd like a master's thesis student to work on that, because one example that I know of, but I haven't had time to look into it, is that La Via Campesina are interested in carbon removal. They actually have carbon removal written into, their kind of, I don't know what that's called, guiding documents for their communities. And they are, explicitly anti-capitalist, right? So that's maybe one example of a place where some of this is happening in a completely different way than what most of the world is thinking about. But then if we think about, this is basically what I'm describing here, degrowth, right? And elements of degrowth policies towards more equality, etc., and well-being, that's supposed to focus on economic growth, exist in many parts of the world. But it doesn't exist, you could say, in the full-blown form where, if we just replicated that, then we'd all be fine, 9 billion people on a planet without crossing any planetary boundaries. But elements of it exist all over the world, including in Denmark. So we just need to identify them and nurture them, I think, if we want to move more towards that. So, and I could say but let's stop it here. Maybe we should have another one on degrowth. That could be fun. And then I could say a little bit, but there's many more who know much more about that than I do.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. One more question, perhaps? Yeah?
Thank you so much. Alarming information that you're giving. I'm just wondering, where is this change coming from? Because it's, the whole COP setup, the UN, market-oriented, and the way that indigenous people are not really given such a big space in that international setup. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on where you see that going, and the way that the international community is actually able to act around these forms of changes that you are advocating.
Yeah, so I mean, many of them are, right? So for instance, if you read ActionAid's policy on this stuff, right, you can read much of what I'm saying here. So there are many international organizations that are pushing for this. But if you go to, if you follow negotiations at the COP26 or what happens in the kind of side discussions on natural climate solutions, it's a lot of this stuff that I've been talking about, companies wanting to do good. They maybe 10 years ago, that's what I've been told by people who followed it 10 or 20 years ago, then there was no representation of indigenous people. There is representation now in those discussions of indigenous people. But we've been monitoring some of the discussions there, and what we typically see is that there's like one indigenous person, right, who comes in the beginning and says something, and then the rest of the discussion continues, or that person is saying stuff that is, like what I'm saying, incompatible with what most of the world is heading towards, right? And then, of course, discursively, it becomes marginalized in those settings, right? So I think the next step is to move beyond that kind of tokenish representation to give indigenous people a much bigger seat at the table or space at the table in those negotiations. Whether that is possible, or and if it happened, whether it would really push things, it's an open question, right? I think if we want to talk about who needs to act, I mean, I think, where were they? This little bubble here, I think this is really where we need to be focusing, right? And most people in Denmark, they're in this group, right? So I mean, so it does fall back on some people like us, because we have also the civil liberties, right? I mean, many of as we all know, indigenous people, if they protest, they get killed or arrested or thrown in jail, etc., etc. Here, the biggest risk is that Liberal Alliance gets through with their ideas of giving people 1 million kroner fine for blocking critical traffic or critical infrastructure, which they're proposing. So
I think on
enough?
that note, I think we thanks for this, Jens, and we'll continue the discussion. We have a little bit of time in the end to where we can, so if you have any questions or anything come up, save it for then, and we'll take it up again. And for now, we'll then, move on from these academic inputs, and then, yeah. And then I'll invite Trine up on the stage from WWF for the input from that side.
Thank you, Marie, and can you hear me? Thanks. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks a lot for inviting me. We need to get it right. We need to get the systems right. We need to change how we produce, how we consume. So Jens, you've been talking a lot about that. I'll speak about how we need to get it right at field level. So how we implement nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions in practice, that was what I was invited to speak about. And I'm Trine, and I work with WWF Denmark. I'll talk about how we work with NBS, how we've started to put it into practice, and also a little bit about scaling NBS. But first about WWF, because probably most of you people know us, but maybe you're not aware that we work not only for biodiversity, we actually work for the benefit of people and the planet. So people here is really at the center of our mission. So stop degradation of the planet's natural environment to build a future for people and the planet. And you can see we have like three different goals. One is about zero extinction of species, one is about zero loss of natural habitats, and one is about halving the footprint. So I think we've been covering those topics throughout the previous presenters. Our theory of change, just want to take this slide because we work really broadly. We work both on conserving and restoring habitats and species, but we also work on food systems and climate change, and we work on also systemic change in terms of finance and governance systems as well as markets. And nature-based solutions is actually fits well within this fairly broad mandate of working with multiple types of nature and ecosystems, etc. So the way we approach NBS or our NBS approach is nested within IUCN's definition and IUCN standard. Marie was talking about that earlier. And also UNEA this year actually has come out also with a definition, so you could say that's probably the highest level global agreement on what defines nature-based solutions. And these two definitions are very similar, but UNEA's definition and what's included in their resolution from this year are I've underlined that. You know, they have a emphasis also on the use, not only the management of natural resources, and they've specified the different ecosystems, as well as also what societal challenges actually means. But as you can see, they're very similar. So WWF works within these definitions and this standard, and Maria talked about the IUCN standard, so I won't talk too much about it, but I'll just say, why do we need a standard? We think, WWF think we need a standard because we actually do need a common language. We actually do need to set criteria and have indicators for how do we go about designing and implementing and monitoring nature-based solutions. And we see IUCN's global standard on nature-based solutions as the best framework for doing that currently. It's also, I just want to highlight, it's also a process standard, if that makes sense. It actually has as part of their standard or their framework, they have a self-assessment tool where you're assessing how are you doing on these 8 criteria and all these 28 indicators, and you do that over time. So it's not like either or, but it's something you improve over time. Maria talked about it, but here you just have like the 8 criteria. But really, why I wanted to take this figure, which is from the standard and the guidance document from IUCN, is that, as you can all see here, societal challenges, that's the starting point. That's at the very core of the IUCN standard. And that's a little bit different, at least to some of the wine that WWF has been drinking over the past years. We would not always be starting our conservation work with local people, local stakeholders defining what the problems are. But adhering to this standard, that's actually where you start. You actually start with asking local stakeholders what are the most pressing issues here, what should be prioritized, and then how do we use nature systems, how do we use ecosystem to address these problems. So yes, ecosystem-based approaches is nothing new. Here I think it's more new about where do you start, what defines what you're going to do. And then of course being very inclusive, rights-based, I think you also said that, Marie, right? It's very comprehensive standard. So within that framework, we have a focus on being place-based, context appropriate, participatory from the outset. There should be local benefits. We should use nature sustainably. Of course, we should also improve nature state. Obviously, for us, it's very important that there are biodiversity outcomes also. It's also very important to consider co-benefits and trade-offs. I'll come back to that. That's probably one of the tricky parts of nature-based solutions and this approach. It should be climate informed. We also work with a landscape intention, so scaling things and working across sectors. That's all theory. Now I'll just say a little bit about how have we started to put that into practice. We've done that with the new funding that WWF Denmark has gotten from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the so-called Strategic Partnership Agreement, SPA, which has started running from January this year and will run for 4 years. And this tree here is actually the theory of change, the overall theory of change for our new program. You can see at the very top we have the impact. So the program is seeking to have an impact of improved human well-being, thriving biodiversity, enhanced climate mitigation, and resilience for people and nature. So you have benefits for people, for nature, for climate. Triple benefit program. That's what we call it in short. The chunk of the tree or the backbone of the program, there you see nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions being applied at landscape level. And then we work in a number of countries and with cross-cutting approaches, including human rights-based, local partnership, etc. And now, why did we think that it was a good idea to apply NBS approach in our new DANITA funding? That's actually a really sweet spot or a good match between development money or development support with conservation agenda. Because the starting point is with the people, but there will also be benefits for nature, benefits for biodiversity. So we said, okay, we'll really go all the way with the new IUCN standard and with the new framework. So let's do it. Let's get started. And then when we were supposed to start, we're like, there's not actually that detailed guidance from IUCN on how do you actually design, how do you engage local stakeholders, and how do you implement, etc. So we had a bit of a question mark there, and then we had to come up with our own process for engaging with our local partners, building knowledge with local partners, before we could even start actually the design, the detailed design of the nature-based solutions in the specific landscapes. I won't go too much into detail, but just to say that we had of course an initial idea with a theory of change from the proposal to Danida, but then we actually started with a stakeholder consultation to let's say flesh out and have validation of what are actually the most pressing societal challenges in the specific areas that we're going to work. And based on that, our teams, our offices in these countries then drafted a nature-based solutions for that solution or solutions for that area. We then went back to the stakeholders and said, okay, does this make sense? Should it be different? What role should you be playing? And then finalize the design of the NBS for that area. And then having done all that, we then completed IUCN's self-assessment tool where you're kind of assessing, am I really good at the governance part, or could I be better, or not at all? Or when it comes to trade-offs and economic viability, how are we doing on all that? So that's the process in very kind of a high level presentation. And now we're more or less ready to start implementation actually. So that took us around 3-4 months, but I would say we were quite pressed for time. It took a lot of knowledge building. It takes time, as I'm sure most of you know, to actually have meaningful participation of local stakeholders. So just an example. So one of the countries in this program is in Madagascar, and we're working in the Mahafali landscape, as you can see here in the southwestern part of Madagascar, a very poor area. And just as an example, you can see here the societal challenges that the local communities identified and prioritized were food security, water security, climate change, socioeconomic development, as well as also environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. Some of the ecosystems in this area are piney forests. You might recall pictures of the piney forests in Madagascar, maybe not. It's very beautiful. Freshwater ecosystems are important to this area. The whole area here is around 100,000 hectares. So far from matching, what was it, 40 million, but anyway, 100,000 hectares, and we're hoping with this intervention we have a target group of a little bit more than 7,000 people, but in total, a little bit more than 100,000 people are living in this area. And as we strengthen the ecosystems, the wetlands, as well as also the terrestrial systems, they will be benefiting as well. So this is I just wanted to include a simplified results chain, because then what are people actually coming up with? What did the communities want in terms of outcomes and at a lower level or higher level, and ultimately the vision? So as you can see here, there's a big focus in our design on how communities can become engaged in implementing the NBS. It's both terrestrial systems as well as also watershed ecosystems. It's also around civil society organizations advocating for improved participation, and some I didn't include here is actually also not only management but also the ownership rights to be reconfirmed and to be actually legalized. And so at the outcome level, to have local actors involved in restoring and sustainably managing ecosystems, as well as, importantly, having improved livelihoods from those, as benefiting from the improved ecosystems. And at the more governance level, to have the intermunicipal level stakeholders integrating NBS into their decision making. All that to contribute and move towards the vision of having a Mahafali landscape that is resilient and that is supporting both communities' well-being, climate adaptation, as well as biodiversity. So, I mean, we're just at the very start, and I think one important point that came out a little bit earlier is that we need, of course, to make sure we actually have outcomes. How do we measure the human well-being outcomes, the biodiversity outcomes? How do we monitor it to actually ensure that we have results? And I think that's also an important part of the IUCN standard, actually, that there are quite high requirements for the targets you're setting and how you go about monitoring and how local people are involved in that monitoring as well of the results you're wanting to see. And then just maybe more as looking again a little bit out, because with the Danida, with the SPA program, we really go in depth as you've just heard, but on the other hand, we also need to act quickly. We need to address the challenges, both the climate, but also the nature crisis that you spoke about earlier, Mikkel. So we also thinking about how can we actually also be scaling. I won't go into details here, but just to say that we are trying to also develop like large-scale cases for nature-based solutions in Africa and other places, but in particular in Africa, where we're working, for example, with the Global Center on Adaptation to see if we can really scale it up. And of course, the challenge and the important part will then be to still ensure those processes being inclusive, respecting the rights of the local people, having meaningful participation, etc. So we'll try to make the ends meet and the experiences from our Danida program come into this larger scale cases for NBS in Africa. So just a few reflections and lessons learned so far with regards to the IUCN standard. So we do see, as I've said, it provides a rights-based framework. It's a process tool. I would also say NBS and at least in the NBS standard of IUCN is just being implemented. There's actually not a lot of experience with implementing on the ground. So we are learning as we are doing. I would also say it's really important, even there are criteria and indicators saying you should engage people, etc., who do you actually include? Who's included in your stakeholder analysis? That becomes extremely important. So we've started, WRBF has started to implement, and we've seen, as I've said, it's extremely resource demanding in terms of time, also money to organize and to mobilize and engage. So we are pushing on, and then we try not to look track of, or let's say, we need to also keep the need for scaling and larger scale changes to happen at the same time. So we need partners, and I'm happy to be here to actually meet a lot of new people and to keep on the discussion. So I think that's what I'm going to say today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Trine. It's so interesting to hear actually what participation means in practice. I mean, it's very different from when we are looking at documents and reading reviews, and then to see, okay, what does it actually mean, stakeholder involvement, who to involve, as you say, and how to do it differently for different groups. So I think maybe a few questions, and then we move on. So, yeah, Jens?
Thanks a lot, Trine, for this. It was super interesting. I wanted to ask, because I'm particularly interested in this question of how we've observed that resource professionals, at least in some African nations, are trained in natural sciences and socialized in ways that make them a little sometimes not very well equipped to engage with people locally. So I don't know, have you observed that also in your process, or are you not working with resource professionals?
So yes, we are as a network, and I can speak mainly from my experience working in Uganda, actually, and I think that's also a reflection from early on. We are working both with the park authorities, but we are very much working also with the communities that are living in the buffer zones. So I wouldn't say I've come across that. I think in Uganda, especially Western Uganda, where we are working, there's such a high population density that also the park authorities know that they need to be working with the buffer zone communities, otherwise it's not possible really to even keep the protected area protected. So I wouldn't say that that's the experience in Africa, but I have heard about it, yeah, elsewhere.
Thanks for that. I think we have, just to make it fair for those that are with us online, we have one question here. So it's a question about indigenous populations and how you include those. And I mean, I think we know that historically there's been less inclusion of them. So what do you specifically do for indigenous peoples to include?
Yeah. So again, I can speak from my experiences where we're working in Myanmar. And actually there we're working in the southern part of Myanmar, we're in territories that are primarily controlled by the Karen people and the Karen National Union. And so for us to do work there, we actually work, I would say, even in parallel with at least what used to be the elected government. Now we actually only work with the Karen National Union and with their local communities. So but before that, it was we consulted with their government and their representations on same terms and in same amounts, if even not more, than the national and state government. So that's what we in Africa. It's not, as you've seen, it's not so much of an issue, but it's we engage them on equal terms as other local communities and have of course translations, etc., as is needed. But I think, in Myanmar, that's actually our primary and the only people we work with currently. Yeah.
Thanks for that. We have a few here who are actually working with Myanmar, so that is, I'm sure, interesting. Maybe one more question here. Yeah.
Thanks for this really interesting presentation. I noticed this morning, Maria, or this afternoon, early afternoon, Maria and Mikkel talked about the role of national associations in terms of actually sustaining activities on the ground, in terms of sustaining long-term impact beyond the funding from external sources. Can you say something about that from your perspective? Both, I can imagine it cannot be from this recently started initiative, but from the other activities in the past of WWF Denmark. Is this something you see across the portfolio also, or how do you see this? Because I think it's quite an interesting and new thing for learning from community-based conservation that Mikkel and Maria's group has detected here.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a really good question, and actually I wanted to pick up on a point I think Mikkel said earlier this afternoon, that NBS can't do it alone. It's not, you can't stand alone on NBS because you do actually need to have organizations that can locally on national level, but in those countries that can keep promoting new governance structures if they've put into place. You also need other kinds of financing. If you don't want the capitalist financing, you need to be able to mobilize financing for conservation locally. And actually, so we are working with that. We've been working with that previously. For example, in Vietnam, I can say we're working on sustainable energy policies, and there a very important part is, of course, to build a civil society alliance that can keep insisting that of this new way or this new governance form or even this new content in a policy. So that's very much a part of how we're working. And the reason I just flipped back to our tree here is that outcome 2 and 3 is around improved accountability and changes in the governance systems and in policies. So and the third is around financing. So those two are more like enablers of nature-based solutions. So yes, enablers, but maybe also sustainers. So yeah, that's part of our approach.
Thank you, Trine. I think we'll stop there and we can continue the discussion later.
Most welcome.
So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, we've already, I think it's a very good way to then transition over to hear more about indigenous peoples. And Stefan from UGIA is here, so the next up. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good, brilliant, perfect. Wow, it's been a very interesting afternoon so far. Loads of interesting interventions and questions. And I'm gonna just present myself first. I'm climate advisor with the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, also known as IFGIA. We're a human rights organization supporting indigenous peoples in promoting and defending their rights, and we're based here in Copenhagen. We have worked for 50 plus years with the global indigenous movement, and throughout this time we have kind of built up a respect and trust that that kind of stems from our approach, which is we never speak on behalf of indigenous peoples, but rather promote their voice. And so likewise today, I'm not gonna express any views or opinions from IFGIA, but rather share some key insights in the debate within the indigenous movement with regards to nature-based solutions. Yes. Before we get to talk about nature-based solutions, allow me to briefly give kind of an intro to the state of the world today with regards to indigenous peoples. Around 6% of the global population are indigenous, and they are, people often ask, who are they, you know, and there's no such clear definition, but this is an estimate, and we know, like the Inuit in the Arctic, the Maasai in East Africa, the Awahun in Amazon, the Karen in Thailand, Myanmar, and so on. You know, they are all over the world, in all regions of the world. There's an estimate that around a quarter of the global surface is under is basically mapped indigenous lands. You know, it may be a larger amount, but that's the best guesstimate there is. So it's significant, and obviously these areas, they include unique ecosystems and vital biodiversity. While indigenous peoples around the world are culturally diverse, they have certain characteristics in common, and one of these is their close relationship with nature. They have established reciprocal relationships of respect and cooperation with the so-called non-human, and these relationships are based on deep values and spirituality. And as such, the dependence with nature goes way beyond just territorial defense and reliance for their livelihoods. But the sad reality is that indigenous peoples for centuries have been victims of systemic colonial violence and continues to be so today, as we've also heard Matthew talk more about that. This is all over the world, not only in Africa. They are being dispossessed from their lands, discriminated against, and excluded from decision making. As a result, they're also suffering disproportionately from the impacts of activities associated with so-called economic growth and development. And in recognition of this, UN member states have agreed that indigenous peoples need special protection under international human rights law. Now, we're not talking about IPLCs or local communities. We're talking about indigenous peoples, and who are defined by indigenous peoples here. They need special recognition and special protection. So while having the same individual human rights as everybody else and local communities or whoever we talk about, indigenous peoples have a unique set of collective rights which are recognized by states. And these includes, amongst other, rights to the lands, territories and resources, and the right to self-determination, which includes the right to autonomy and self-governance. And very key, the governments and other actors must obtain the free, prior and informed consent, the FPIC, from indigenous peoples for any action that may affect them or their territories. Matthew briefly mentioned that as well. So now let's focus on conservation regimes and how these have impacted indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, while indigenous peoples fight extractivism and other invasive exploitation of their territories, they increasingly also face the threat of top-down climate action, as we have heard Jens talk about. And this is not just about, well, it's conservationist policies. It's also renewable energy projects and adaptation projects, not just not safeguarding their rights. And with regards to conservation regimes, government tend to fail to listen to indigenous peoples and understand the value of how they protect nature. So these policies fail to distinguish between indigenous sustainable living and external destructive interests. There are examples from several countries of how such policies have been central to the eviction, criminalization and dispossession of indigenous peoples from the lands and territories. For instance, right now, more than 100,000 Maasai and Babaik are threatened by eviction from their ancestral lands in the Ngorongoro conservation area in Tanzania. Again, a result of climate policies and conservation policies failing to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. But today, thanks to indigenous peoples' effective advocacy, and I'd love to talk more about how active they are in the international climate and biodiversity negotiations. We follow them closely and support them in Ivigia. There's an increasing recognition of the needs for rights safeguards and conservation, including in the debate around NBS, as we have heard today, nature-based solutions. But there's still a long way to go before the rights of indigenous peoples are truly protected by such initiatives as, unfortunately, in many cases, safeguards are becoming a mere cosmetic box-ticking exercise. Yeah, there are some, as mentioned, there are indigenous representatives from all 7 socio-cultural regions of the world engaged in international climate policy and national climate policy. And while they produce common positions and statements on issues, it is only natural that they also represent different viewpoints on certain issues. But that said, with regards to the bigger questions around climate change, such as what caused climate change and or the climate and biodiversity crisis, and what should be the response, indigenous peoples generally speak united in one strong voice. They point to the fact that the root causes are anthropogenic and structural. Indeed, to blame is the dominant mindsets that have validated colonialism, industrialism, and capitalism for centuries. Indigenous peoples themselves are facing climate injustice in terms of a colonial déjà vu. The same colonial structures which have done them harm for centuries are also the root cause to the climate and biodiversity crisis, in which indigenous peoples, despite their resilience, are exposed as the most vulnerable to its impacts. The supremacy of one dominant knowledge system in the global climate discourse has led to the construction of a so-called climate problem, which then blocks discussions from focus on or discussions from the root causes. And so now, to deal with the so-called climate problem, we need solutions, and lately they have become nature-based. So this is the dominant discourse, right, around this. The problem here is that this leads to an instrumentalization of nature that kind of reinforces the human nature dichotomy, as we've heard today also, which dominate Western thinking. And so, in other words, nature provides benefits to human beings, right? That's the thinking, and this goes very much against the cosmovisions of indigenous peoples, which regard human beings as being part of nature. And so, a focus on so-called nature-based solutions therefore distract focus from the structural root causes, which must be addressed, and first and foremost, through rapid decarbonization. Nowhere is the contradiction between indigenous knowledge systems and hegemonic Western discourse as evident as when it comes to so-called carbon markets, which have also been talked about today. Indeed, nature-based solutions has become a politically charged terminology applied by governments and private companies alike as an instrument to reach their respective net zero targets. but a system justifying continued emissions in one country by commodifying forest and nature in another country through carbon credits only reaffirms indigenous peoples in their concern that colonialist and neoliberal structures are still in place today. They warn that such false solutions are incompatible with the 1.5-degree pathway as set out in the Paris Agreement. And further to this sudden interest and flow of funding available in these carbon markets risk creating the wrong incentives and lead to immense spending pressures, resulting in projects being poorly designed, failing not only to meet their climate objectives, but also repeating a history of multidimensional violence against indigenous peoples. And maybe just to say that since COP26 in November, IVGIA has been approached by 4 or 5 different voluntary carbon mechanisms, trying to get through us to get indigenous peoples engaged, and there's a lot of pressure since the Article 6 rule book was agreed. Despite the inherent challenges and dangers indigenous people see in the concept of nature-based solutions, they do not sit idle. They engage constructively and proactively in processes around NBS in both national and international levels, but they struggle in being heard and recognized. Both their knowledge and rights are ignored in the design of NBS interventions, as indigenous peoples are often excluded from the design process and governance of these. While the IUCN Global Standard includes a couple of constructive references to FPIC, free, prior and informed consent, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples where relevant or where applicable, the majority of the criteria in the global standard do not reference indigenous peoples, and indeed they uphold concepts such as conservation and ecosystem services that either directly or indirectly lead to epistemic violence against indigenous peoples. Therefore, the advocacy of indigenous peoples is paramount, and whether the concept of the day is REDD+ or protected areas or nature-based solutions, they patiently engage with the same propositions and demands, and some of the most important are indigenous peoples ask for a place at the decision table in which they are recognized for who they really are. They are protectors of vast lands and stewards of nature. And with regards to NBS, nature-based solutions, they do not just want to be asked for their consent, they demand to be part of the design, implementation and governance structure of any intervention affecting them or their territories. Indigenous peoples also ask for their knowledge to be recognized in climate research. This can be done through so-called co-production of knowledge, or two-eyed seeing, which acknowledges the validity of plural knowledge systems. Both indigenous knowledge and non-indigenous science are framed as lenses that can together create a holistic view of solutions. This can lead to a shift towards indigenous conceptualizations of NBS as systems of reciprocal relationships upheld by indigenous self-determination, necessary to prevent another form of climate colonization. And yet another demand is the full realization and effective safeguarding of their rights in any climate action, as reiterated in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. Again, rather than applying a politically charged term such as nature-based solutions, indigenous peoples remind that with adequate political will to secure their rights to their lands, territories and resources, real conservation would indeed flourish. This would require a relatively small effort from governments and other stakeholders, but the result would be a true game changer. Indeed, securing the rights of indigenous peoples is not just a moral imperative, it is also essential for the rescue of nature and climate. And then allow me to conclude with a brief example of an indigenous-led initiative that has great potential for replication. I think there was a question around that as well earlier, of an example. Here we have the Wampis people, of the Amazon region of Peru. There are around 15,300 people. But the territory is larger than Wales or here in Denmark, Fyn and Sjælland together. Indeed, it's 1.3 million hectares. In 2015, they established the autonomous territorial government of the Wampis Nation in order to exercise their right to self-determination and autonomy. Through this governance structure and their own protocols, the Wampis are able to protect the territory effectively against logging, gold mining, old exploration, and so on. And further to this, at COP26, the Wampis presented their own climate strategy and established the Wampis Climate Fund to support the invaluable contribution of the territory to the global efforts to address climate change. The community-owned fund intends to support the cultural strength and resilience of the Wampis Nation for the success and protection of that territory. And I believe we will see more of such initiatives, not only for the benefit of nature and climate, but also based on and in defense of the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you very much. And then allow me just to briefly mention that each year we publish the Indigenous World, and it's the first half is about chapters is about countries. So we have a chapter on Myanmar, a chapter on Nepal and Tanzania, and so on. And then the second half is about international processes. So if you want to know more about how indigenous peoples engage in the UNFCCC, in the Green Climate Fund, in the CBD, and so on, there's a chapter on each process here. Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. That was really interesting and really a nice transition also, so we get the full aspects of what does this mean for indigenous people. So thank you for that contribution. I think we will just take a few questions directly for Stefan, and then we will have a discussion, so invite the speakers up here. But maybe if there are some questions specifically for Stefan here. Yes, yes.
It's kind of specific, but now you mentioned Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where the point 6.2 and 6.4 is about markets, but there's also Article 6.8, which is about voluntary collaboration and transfer of funds to developing countries or indigenous people to fight climate change, which is a non-market mechanism. Do indigenous people, do you support that mechanism, and do you try to highlight it? And do you know anything about whether others are highlighting it? Because it seems to have kind of gone missing.
6.8. Yeah, there is. It's early days still, and so while the rule book was agreed in November, I think right now this week there's been further negotiations around it, and in the June session in Bonn there will be further sessions on this. So there is still a lot of doubt and lack of clarity on how Article 6 is going to work and how the 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8 are gonna interact and to what degree. But this is also an opportunity for indigenous peoples and civil society to engage in advocacy around that and help frame that. So I don't think I can say much more than this. Just to say that with regards to the market mechanisms, obviously indigenous peoples were generally very skeptical towards that, but they said if they had to be agreed, they must take point of departure in their rights or safeguard their rights. And so they succeeded in getting references in all the 3 articles to the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which talks about indigenous people's rights should be respected in any climate action. But unfortunately, the very key reference to free, prior, and informed consent was not included. Indeed, there was a very weak mentioning of consultation as appropriate or something. And then also they wanted an independent grievance mechanism, which ended up being an independent grievance procedure, I think, which is also watering down. But the work is ongoing, and it's still early days with regards to that.
That's interesting, thank you. Are there any other questions here for Stefan? Yes?
Maybe it's for Stephen as well as the other present us, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because we haven't talked so much today about the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, but that's coming up as a major international agreement that probably will be agreed upon later this year. And interestingly, 2 of the 3 innovations in this new agreement has been discussed a lot today. One of the major innovations is 30% of the land and marine areas should be protected areas. We heard earlier today Matthew talking about against this whole concept of protected areas, right? And interestingly, another one of the 3 major innovations in this new agreement is private sector mediated conservation. And we heard Jens today speaking very much against the approach that have been taken there. Okay, so that's 2 of the 3 major innovations in the, in this Convention on Biodiversity's global agreement that most likely will be agreed upon in a few months from now. I don't want to put Mike on the spot, but Mike, I think you're the only representative today here from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I know the current government, they have biodiversity as one of the key areas that they want to prioritize. Can maybe Mike share with us some thoughts about, combining? I'm sure you also attended the 92-gruppe conference 2 weeks ago, Mike. A lot of people attended the 92 group, the Danish Association of Environment Development Organizations. They held a conference 2 weeks ago at Christiansborg, where they discussed the post-2020 global biodiversity agreement. And I'm really, really eager to hear some thoughts from those that are responsible for these 5% of the Danish aid that is going to be used on biodiversity. How are you going to use those money? And what are your thoughts when you combine the experiences from the insight from the discussions today with knowing about the post-2020 biodiversity framework priorities? How are we going to go about that?
So I don't know, Mike, if you we prefer not to be put on the spot here, or if you have anything you would like to share with us. We'll give you a chance at least, yeah? Maybe while Mike responds, maybe if I can ask.
I think you'll probably get much more interesting insights by convening your panel and letting the audience ask questions to your panel. That was the purpose of the session, I think. And I'm certainly not in a position to make any formal statement on behalf of the Danish government about how we're spending money. I'm sorry, but if you want that statement, then you need to look somewhere else. For example, on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where you will find news items about, for example, a reallocation of funds to cope with the influx of Ukrainian refugees. And other related subjects. So, if you want that kind of information, Finn, I think you have to go somewhere else. I'm not going to make a statement on that here. But I do have some questions for the panel as a participant in a session. So,
I'm scared. Okay, so let's invite the speakers up here on the floor.
Ja. Nej, bare behold den på, hvis kan I svare. Så I lige skal den her på igen?
Ja, men det er fint, finder vi ud af.
Vil I hellere have en mikrofon? Ja. Få en af dele her. Jeg sætter den. Så kan I bare dele den her. Den er tændt, men så kan I bare...
Yeah, so I think they took your microphone again, Mike. So maybe I take another question and you can ask your question after. We got some questions in before the seminar from some of the live speakers. One from Rebecca Kariuki, who's at the University of York. And one of her questions is, how do... I think my micro is okay. How do we ensure equity and justice in selecting NBS options when there are conflicting benefits and risks for different stakeholder groups? I think this goes to the core of what some of the things we've discussed today. And I don't know, I would be very interested to hear Stefan and Trine on this for sure, I'm sure. Yeah, how do we ensure equity and justice in selecting NBS options when there are conflicting benefits and risks for different groups, different stakeholder groups? Does anyone want to start on this one? Trine?
That's a really good question. Yeah, it's. I think that's built into any kind of change process that you really, when you're trying to make a change locally, you will face this issue because it is a political process essentially. So there will be different interests among different groups, even within a village, very very locally. So how do you balance that? So maybe speaking just from within the framework of the IUCN standard, the way they've tried to buffer for that is to have, of course, a very transparent process. And a lot of requirements with regards to documentation. So who are you engaging? Who's represented at what meetings? And what decisions are being made there? What are the benefits to who? And who are the winners and who are the losers? And then what are then eventually the decisions on what should be the components of or special focus of an MBS in a particular area. So at least they are trying to, with transparency and with requirements, trying to buffer for it. But that being said, it will always be a challenge because essentially change anywhere and locally is a political process. So we'll have to try to support, of course, the weaker voices in those societies, which very often are women and youth. So of course we have a WF working, we have a particular focus on that, but yeah, it's a real challenge. Thanks. Stefan?
Thanks. I think, the question is interesting, but maybe the question is, with regards to indigenous peoples, it's more like, again, this concept of NBS, the whole conceptualization of that, maybe needs to be revisited. But one of the things that the indigenous scholars who are doing research on this find is by talking with knowledge holders is that there shouldn't be like a single definition or a single way of doing NBS if indeed we are to continue with that terminology. And so I think, as the recommendations are that I presented there is about governance and participation and a rights-based focus. But again, allowing like global NBS practitioners should consult from the very beginning of the design process with indigenous stakeholders and allowing them to essentially be the ones designing this, and you'll see many times they will go away from these terminologies and just talk about, again, their rights, about securing their land rights. Sometimes it's not financial. There's no financial implications. It's political will, really, and then take it from there. Yeah, but I just want, like we talked about indigenous, whether there is research out there on the NBS. It's a new term and stuff, but at least this year I know of 3 to 5 peer-reviewed journal articles from indigenous scholars presenting indigenous research on this specific issue, which may be of relevance. So.
Yeah, that also speaks directly to, I think, Matthew's point before about including more publications in or decolonizing academia with inclusion of indigenous scholars from indigenous peoples groups. Are there any of the others that would like to respond to this question in particular, or we move on? Mike, you mentioned before you had a question. Would you like to?
Yeah, 2 questions, but just a quick preamble first. On the question of colonialism, and impact on conservation. You know, I think you should bear in mind that, at least according to some interpretations, we are currently experiencing a colonial war or a special military operation, or whatever you want to call it, in Europe. You know, an attempt by one nation to colonize and take over the territory of another nation on a big scale, as everybody knows, and to grab the land. Rich land, 20% of the world's wheat comes from Ukraine and the southern part of Russia. So we're in a colonial context in that struggle, where the Ukrainian people, according to some interpretations, don't exist and should be gotten rid of. They should become Russians or whatever. I have two questions: an activist political question and an academic question, and you've just touched on these things, but I think they need to be explored much more thoroughly. One of them is in relation to the sort of decolonization agenda. That is, it's also, as you know from Latin American struggles and also from many African countries, it's potentially a very violent struggle. I remember, people keeping their organizations hidden underground because they were afraid of retaliation, because they were doing conservation work. So, and I wonder if the organizations like the WWF and others are really equipped in the places where you're working to, really defend the rights of some of the people who are under attack. And sadly, I think, these conflicts are getting tougher and tougher, and I wonder if the consequences are being properly thought through by organizations that are trying to defend rights of different people. That's one question. The other question is to do with the academic agenda. What I'm actually responsible for in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a focal point for research. And I'm very curious, that's the reason I came to this meeting, to hear about, what is the vanguard, what is the frontline research agenda? And you've touched a little bit on it, but I think we need to be thinking very much, very fast forward about what are the topics that we really need to understand thoroughly and do more intensive research in order to understand the nature-based solutions and the obstacles and the potential. You've touched on a lot of the issues here, but I'd like to hear your follow-up comments on what is the research agenda.
Thank you, Mike. Should we take the first question first? I think that's maybe Trine.
Thanks for that question. It's quite spot on. I mean, we are a conservation organization, and have for a shorter period of time maybe be working more on, let's say, hardcore governance issues. I think it's been an area that we are picking up on in a number of ways. Firstly, I would say we've strengthened our own internal social policies and our own kind of safeguard system. How should we be working? There was also a question earlier, like how do we work with indigenous peoples, or how do we work with local people? So we have to follow and adhere to our own social policies and requirements and our safeguards. So that's the first one. But secondly, and more importantly, we work with partners, local partners. So as I've said earlier, we spend a lot of effort in working with local civil society and supporting local civil society. The way we work, we would have a local office, say in Uganda, we'll have a WWF Uganda, we'll have a WWF Vietnam, and so they are really representing us there, but still they are often regarded as international civil society. So we have to work to even have a credible voice and a mandate. We need to be partnering with local civil societies, which we are. The question is then, is that enough? In some cases, it is enough over time, and in some cases, maybe it's we've come a bit short. But at least we are trying to strengthen that side, and that we're doing in particular through through partnerships and long-term support of civil society. I mentioned before we've been building up for example, an alliance of sustainable energy in Vietnam. It's actually a very coal-based and oil-based energy sector, and it's a black box in terms of how do they do their energy planning. So for, I would say, around 15 years, we've been supporting civil society in how can they influence that and how can they support local people and local communities around, let's say, rights violations within that sector. So I would say through partnerships, we're trying.
Thanks, Trine. And then maybe we follow up with a second question, the more academic question. So anybody wants to jump in now?
I mean, I'd love to hear Matthew's take on it. For instance, if you want to respond to that, Matthew, the kind of research agendas on NBS that are important as we move forward. Oh, I think you're muted, or...
Matthew, could you just unmute your microphone, please?
Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jens. And I think one of the sort of agendas that we have been thinking, which was also asked by Mikkel, if I remember correctly, but also I think also other people have asked also similar question. I think for nature-based solutions that are to work for both ecological integrity and social justice, I think one of the areas that is very important for most of us in this part of the world is to document practical grassroots examples on how indigenous perspectives, could really shape conservation science and practice. Because I think that's very important when it comes to influencing conservation agendas at higher level authorities, with the like of IUCN, but also WWF. I think for researchers from this part of the world, having such documentation and such evidence, we find it to be very important for that case in terms of how that could influence discussions at higher level, because I think that's very important, especially with the increasing calls for protection, as have been mentioned by Maria, and in terms of the 30-30 agenda, but also in terms of the Half-Earth initiative by this American, the former American ecologist. So I think for that case, we need to have examples of how we can have conservation of these natural resources, that would work for both the ecological part, but also for the social justice based on this indigenous perspective. So having such examples and concrete evidence, I think is one of the agendas that that could quite be interesting to follow.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Any other comments to that question?
Well, I can have a go too. I think every academic you will ask in the world will have a different response, very closely related to their own research interests. But I think, we talked a little bit during some of the presentations on this concept of working landscapes, which is basically about, how is conservation already built into the sustainable resource use management systems in some places around the world. So it's already there, but how can we scale that up, or how can we move that into also our part of the world, right? And I think it's interesting you asked from a research perspective, what kind of institutions do we need? Do we need different institutions? Do we need different organizations to try and regulate that? So that certainly, a farmer has to start, as we know here from Denmark, to start setting aside certain areas for fallow, or whatever you call it in English, to have more biodiversity. So what kind of rules and what kind of institutions develop around that? I think that's interesting. The other one is in relation to what Matthew and others have said, which is how, if we start getting indigenous knowledge and local knowledge more into the the natural resource governance systems and the decisions that we make and the way designs are made. What happens when these different actors meet, right? So there's already a body of research on that around the multiple evidence approaches, but I think there's a need for more grounded research on what actually happens in those situations when indigenous knowledge suddenly travels to a ministry somewhere in a country. So what do we do with this knowledge, and how do we get it upwards into the global systems? And I think again, identifying particular areas where that has happened and what is needed to make that happen and get good outcomes is important.
Yeah, thanks, Mikkel. Jens, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I can add, and I mean, it's not going to come as a surprise, I think, but maybe back on to this kind of how do we integrate indigenous knowledge? So it's actually been attempted in the IPBES process, and there's some reflections coming out of that, because sometimes those types of knowledges are just incommensurable, right? Seeing a mountain as some rocks or a living being, those two things are difficult to put in the same chart or the same graph or the same table. And so I think from the IPBES process, there's already some experiences that one could maybe learn from in relation to that process. And I think that would be interesting to follow, maybe also hear how that is going on and how one could shape that process as we're contributing to that here from Denmark. And the other one, I think, is how do we avoid that NBS becomes a distraction, right? How do we avoid to repeat the history of REDD+ and what we've been talking about? I think for me personally, that's the major question. We didn't have 10 years to waste when REDD+ came onto the stage, and we certainly don't have 10 years to waste now, right, in terms of climate and ecological crisis. So how do we avoid that, and how do we keep sharp on that agenda, and how do we think about social transformation, not only where NBS is implemented, but also where NBS is not implemented, but where some of the pressures that put pressure on NBS solutions come from, right? And here I'm obviously thinking again on consumption patterns, et cetera, in our part of the world, and how we're sometimes duped a little bit, I think, by corporations, governments, but also by ourselves and our habits and our ways of thinking in terms of how do we find our way out of this, of these challenging crises that we're facing. So a little bit of academic, but also a little bit activist, I think you could hear there.
Yeah. Stefan?
Just want to comment as well, like indigenous peoples generally, when we talk about integrating knowledge or something, they say, no, stop, this is not what it's about. It's about, again, co-production of knowledge. You know, it's about, I mean, for centuries, indigenous people's knowledge have been extracted and abused, you know, in the pharmaceutical industry and so on. You know, it's not, that is not what it's about. A couple of years ago, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform was established at the UNFCCC. That is not about extracting indigenous people's knowledge and in climate solutions. No, it's about having a platform to give voice to the indigenous peoples in order to promote these things, such as the co-production of knowledge and sightseeing. And in addition to talk about like research, I just also want to kind of say, like, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform is open for everybody. All contributors can sit in, listen to the indigenous knowledge holders, and also contribute in the sessions around that are open. Also like the special rapporteurs on human rights, the UN special rapporteurs on indigenous people's rights, the newly selected new rapporteur on climate and human rights, Ian Fry and stuff. They all do work around this as well, around the human rights in climate change and in climate action, and often with a specific focus on indigenous people's rights. These reports are quite good, and they're validated by indigenous peoples. If we don't want to wait till peer-reviewed materials come out, you know, just have a Google and follow what's the latest within the UN and beyond. Thanks.
Just a very concrete point and maybe action point, really. So Matthew, happy to continue the conversation in Kenya on maybe how can we have a collaboration on nature-based solutions in Kenya, as that's also where WWF is working. So happy to pick up the conversation from today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thanks, Matthew, as well. Thanks to the speakers. I think for now we're running a little bit out of time, so I think I'll say thank you to you, and then Mikkel, for you to maybe say a few words to round off.
Yes, that was really just in case the presentations weren't clear. I think the presentations have actually been quite clear today. Lots of messages. So I don't think there's a need to sum up. I think it's fairly clear. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for hanging in, Matthew. I know it's a bit more boring in front of a screen than live, and thanks to everybody also if there's anybody still left on the live stream. So I guess that's it. Thank you everybody. Yeah. Okay.